Okay, so in this video, we're going to finish up AP Bio topic 4.5 and talk about positive feedback loops. So we will discuss lactation, childbirth, ethylene, and blood clotting factors. So a couple different examples to see how positive feedback loops work. So in our previous video, we talked a lot about homeostasis and using hormones and the endocrine system to keep our bodies in balance, to keep different conditions level. But not all hormones are going to work this way, right? So in a positive feedback loop, instead of reducing the stimulus, the hormones here will actually amplify. And the release of the hormones will actually cause a movement away from the set point. So we're going to look at our first example here will be with the posterior pituitary hormone, oxytocin. So if you remember, the hypothalamus is located within the brain, and below the hypothalamus, actually an extension of the hypothalamus, is the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary doesn't actually produce any hormones on its own. Instead, there's specialized cells called neurosecretory cells that will actually extend into the posterior pituitary and produce the hormone oxytocin. So oxytocin is probably my favorite hormone. It is the love hormone or the bonding hormone. It's what makes you feel connected to another person. So when you first fall in love with someone, you actually will release oxytocin and it makes you feel connection. But interestingly, they've studied this with dogs, like how humans feel so connected to their dog and the dog to the owner. So they actually took blood samples from dogs and then allowed the owner and the dogs to play, and then took blood samples after, and they actually saw an increase in oxytocin in the dog circulatory system, in their blood. And so that is one reason why dogs feel such an attraction or connection to their owner. It's due to the hormone oxytocin. So anyway, so oxytocin is released. It's produced in the hypothalamus region of the brain, but it's released from the posterior pituitary, and it travels through the bloodstream to its target cells. So oxytocin, yes, it's released in a number of different reasons, but we're going to look at two. So here, it'll travel through the bloodstream to its target cells. So when a mother is breastfeeding, oxytocin is one of the hormones involved in that milk production. But we wouldn't want a baby who is trying to breastfeed to have the milk. If milk all of a sudden is being produced, we don't want negative feedback to stop it, right? We want to amplify and have more milk show up for that baby. So let's look at how both the nervous system and the endocrine system work together to make this happen. So when a baby is breastfeeding, there are sensory neurons in the breast tissue. So a sensory neuron is a type of nerve cell that will send messages to the brain. So here, it'll send messages to the brain that the baby is trying to feed. And the brain, remember, that's where the hypothalamus is. So the hypothalamus will produce oxytocin. So here, the baby suckles for milk, sensory neurons send a message to the brain. Now, the oxytocin is produced, and it'll be released through or out of the posterior pituitary. It'll travel through the bloodstream to the target cells. Now, it's not just the hormone oxytocin, but there's another hormone called prolactin, and together, both prolactin and oxytocin will work to release milk for that baby. Well, now that baby's like, oh, there's more food, and therefore feeds even more. And so therefore that mom's sensory neurons will send a message to the brain, right? And the brain will again produce oxytocin. And then I believe prolactin is produced in the anterior pituitary, but don't quote me on that. So prolactin and oxytocin will then be produced and travel to the breast tissue in order to release even more milk, and it just keeps on amplifying. So that is a positive feedback loop that amplifies lactation in breastfeeding animals. Okay, so again, that's based on hormones and sensory neurons in the nervous system. Okay, so let's look at and it continues. So now we're going to look at childbirth, though, and how childbirth is also an example of a positive feedback loop and a stimulus causing the amplification of the response. So here, when a baby's head is pushing on the cervix, again, there's sensory neurons that will send a message to the brain that it's time to deliver the baby. So now what will happen is the brain receives those messages and will release the oxytocin. So again, it will be released from the posterior pituitary, and the oxytocin will travel through the bloodstream where it'll reach the uterus. So the uterus has very strong muscular like walls on that organ. And so when the oxytocin reaches those target cells, it causes contractions. And so the oxytocin attaching to its receptor on the uterine wall causes contractions that then push on the baby, right? So now the oxytocin causes contractions that push on the baby, which pushes the head against the cervix even more. And then the cervix has the sensory neurons that send a message to the brain. The brain sends out more oxytocin that travels in the blood to the uterus. It contracts again, and then it pushes the baby against the cervix and then sends a message to the brain. And this is why during childbirth, during labor, the contractions start out far apart and then they amplify. They get like stronger and closer together. And that is all due to an increase in the amount of oxytocin being released from the brain in this positive feedback loop. Now, we should say once the baby's born, that will break that positive feedback cycle. However, we saw in that previous video or previous slide here during breastfeeding that oxytocin is also released here. So just a heads up, if you ever have children, what also happens is the uterus during pregnancy, the uterus expands about 1,000 times of its original size. Well, after birth, that needs to contract and go back to its original size. So what will happen is when the baby breastfeeds, that oxytocin that's released for milk production, but also maternal bonding to make a mother feel connected to that offspring, right? In that like love hormone release, like that connection. Anyway, so when the oxytocin, though, during breastfeeding reaches the uterus walls, because it's important to remember that hormones travel throughout the entire body in the bloodstream, but they only have effects on cells that have receptors. So the uterus does have receptors for oxytocin. So when that oxytocin reaches the uterus after birth, it'll still cause contractions. So the first couple days after delivery, a breastfeeding mother will experience kind of intense contractions after birth to have that uterus return to its normal size. So females who plan to have children, just know that kind of pain is coming. All right, so that's positive feedback in birth. Now let's change gears and go to fruit. So fruit ripening is also an example of positive feedback. So if you've heard the term, one like rotten apple spoils the whole bunch, this is like the science behind that. But when we say rotten apple, okay, so there's a hormone called ethylene that is produced by a ripening fruit. So the ethylene itself is the ligand to start the ripening process, but ethylene is also released into the air from a ripened fruit. So it is a response as well as like a ligand. So here, if you have this like banana that is ripe, it will actually release this hormone. Plants have hormones. They have about 6 different hormones. This one is in gas form. It's a gaseous hormone. And this ripening fruit will release this hormone and it'll travel to nearby fruits where it will act as a ligand in their ethylene pathway that will then trigger signal transduction pathways that lead to the ripening of those fruits. And then they send out the ethylene hormone that then targets other fruits, and causes them to ripen. So you can see here how just one ripe banana then triggers the ripening of the rest. It amplifies. So the rotten apple analogy is because ethylene is produced during ripening, but it's also produced when when a fruit is like bruised. So when it's damaged. So if there's mechanical stress, it's called, like, I should have planned better had a fruit here, but let's say that my like water glass here is an apple. So let's say an apple gets like a cut well, those cells in that area, in that tissue, are going to start to release ethylene. Or if it gets bruised, like if you drop the apple and there's like a dent in that bruised, like mushy area, that will also be producing ethylene. So that's where the one rotten apple spoils the whole bunch comes from. Okay, and then our last example is going to be blood clotting factors. So our blood vessels are really important in our circulatory system to transport blood throughout our bodies. And if we ever have damage on the walls of our blood vessels, like that is going to be pretty like serious. If you don't repair that wound or that damage to the blood vessel, you run the risk of the blood flowing out of your circulatory system, like and into your tissues, and that would not be good. So we need a way to have a rapid response to repair that and stop the blood loss. So in the cells of the blood vessels, like of a vein, for example, there are these glycoproteins. I know when I taught about the cell membrane, I didn't emphasize these very much, but on the surface of our cells, we have things called glycoproteins and glycolipids. Well, there's a glycoprotein, which is basically a transmembrane protein with a little chain of carbohydrates. So there's a special one called TF that is on the blood vessels inside of the on the cells inside of the blood vessels. And when like blood comes in contact with it, when there's damage, now what happens is that glycoprotein will signal the start of the signal transduction pathway to repair this and like block the blood from flowing out. So what happens is basically the final cell response will be to make these like fibrous molecules, like these strings called fibrin, that will actually trap platelets. So platelets, like if you've ever had a scab, platelets are little fragments of red blood cells that like clump together to form like scabs. But here on the inside of our blood vessels, these fibrin fibers will actually trap those platelets, and now that'll form like a blockage to stop the blood from flowing out of that damaged blood vessel. So this is a good thing that happens, but sometimes it can form too large of a clot. That can also happen as well, and we'll talk about on the next slide. So when we look at the blood clotting signal transduction pathway, there's actually a couple different ways to start the whole cascade. But really what we're seeing here is that there are a lot of different proteins involved. So each of these proteins are referenced as like factors. So like that red one is like factor 7. Here, like they activate factor 10. And then factor 10 activates factor 5. Okay, so all of like the red, orange, yellow, green, like these are all different proteins involved in the signaling cascade of trying to build the final cell response of these fibrin fibers. So now, here's where like it happens. And so this green factor 5 protein will take an inactive prothrombin, is that how you say it? And form thrombin. Now, thrombin is going to then be like the protein that forms fibrin, which are those yellow fibers. And then you can have like the cross-linked like clots start to form. So now you might be thinking, but how is this a positive feedback loop? Like how is this getting amplified? Well, the cool thing, and also not so cool thing in some situations, is that the thrombin protein, when it is active, it actually will feed back and like activate more proteins upstream in the signaling pathway. So thrombin itself, once activated, will activate more. It looks like factor 11, factor 8, factor 5, and it'll keep on amplifying the production of even more thrombin and even more fibrin. And so it's a really fascinating feedback loop, a positive feedback loop or feedback cycle that amplifies by activating proteins upstream to keep it going and make more and more of those fibrous yellow fibrin molecules to trap the platelets and form blood clots. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a way we can also inactivate this. So now here's a little personal story about me. So let's focus on this factor 5 right here, this green protein that is involved in activating thrombin. So here in the diagram, when you see the circles like this, turn like that, that means it became activated. So now these are all proteins, and so our genes, our DNA located in our chromosomes are what have the directions to build each of these proteins. So in all of our signal transduction pathways, all of our cascades, all of the ways our cells work, we hope that our proteins fold up correctly and that all of these pathways work normally. However, I truthfully, I inherited an allele or a mutation in my factor V gene. So my factor V protein, actually we have 2 chromosomes, right? So one of my chromosomes is fine, makes the normal factor V protein here to activate thrombin. However, my other chromosome, I actually inherited a mutated version where that protein actually stays active longer than it should. So if factor V stays active longer than it should, then you can imagine you'd have even more thrombin and fibrin be produced. And it turns out that when I was 25, so a decade ago, I had a massive blood clot that stretched from my pelvic bone all the way down to my knee. My entire leg swelled up, and it's now been 12 years, and my leg is still 2 inches bigger than my other one. The entire blood clot ended up forming scar tissue, and my body had to build new veins around it. When it happened, I couldn't walk for months. It took me about a year before I could even run a mile, and about 5 or 6 years of every time I'd run or exercise, I'd be crying, it'd be so painful, because when you have these massive blood clots in your veins, then the blood can't flow. And if the blood can't flow, you get like a traffic jam or like a backup, and the fluid from in your blood leaks into your tissues and you have massive swelling. It's an incredibly painful thing, but for those of you going into the medical field, that is a deep vein thrombosis. So now, when I experience that, there are ways that we can turn off these signaling cascades. So one of the medications was warfarin that I took, and warfarin actually is rat poison. And basically, it works by inhibiting certain proteins in that cascade. So you can see if you take a drug medication that will inhibit proteins, then you're not going to form as many blood clots. Now, at this time, when I was taking warfarin, any little cut I would get, I would bleed a lot. It took a very long time to make scabs. I also took a drug called heparin that did the same thing. It inactivated different proteins within the pathway. Truthfully, when I was pregnant, I had to take blood thinners so I didn't get blood clots in my placenta or something for my child, which would then result in death for him. So they actually had to change my blood thinners right before birth so that way I didn't bleed to death during delivery. Now, the other thing, I forgot to mention is earlier we talked about oxytocin. When a woman goes into labor or doesn't go into labor and she's induced, what that means is the hospital staff will start or force labor to start. And basically, the female will be given Pitocin. Pitocin is a man-made chemical that mimics oxytocin. So in and induced labor, Pitocin will mimic oxytocin to bring on the contractions. Okay, so if you are taking warfarin or heparin, though, then you can see how you'll have a reduction in blood clotting factors or fibrin molecules forming. Now, the other thing I should mention is there's a genetic disease called hemophilia, and in hemophilia, it's the opposite of this. They're missing, they have a deleted or missing proteins in this pathway, and they don't make scabs at all. So hemophilia is the opposite of too much blood clots, and instead the person runs a risk of bleeding to death. Now, I should also mention that blood clots occur all of the time, very naturally within our bodies. They're usually little tiny things that can flow through our blood vessels. However, when we look at, in America at least, our number one killer is heart disease. 1 out of 3 Americans will die of a heart attack or a stroke. And a heart attack and a stroke are basically blood clots in the heart or a blood clot in the brain. And so why that happens, though, is partly because of our poor diets, our blood vessels start to fill in with plaque and they begin to narrow. So normally, if a blood clot can flow just fine through open and clear artery. Well, as it begins to narrow over the course of a life of like a poor diet, now blood clots, basically the channels, the blood vessels get narrower and narrower, and eventually a clot will get stuck, and that is a heart attack. It stops the blood from flowing. So anyway, sorry, a little bit long video here on positive feedback loops, but hopefully it was helpful and related to things that you've heard about in life. All right, good job.